Most of you, or several of you asked before church, those of you who got to talk to me while you're turning there, I will say that I have a praise. We got power at our new house, so we're thanking the Lord for that. Went over there today, and the heat is on, and the lights are on, and the clock on the oven is on, and all that fun stuff, so we're excited about that. And Lord willing, we'll be moving in this weekend. Joe Reedling, who most of you know, who started Hope Haven there in South Africa, he's going to be there first thing in the morning, Lord willing, to cut the water on. A couple of last things. You can't get water until you get power. So anyway, we got power. We'll get the water cut on, and Lord willing, none of that will be leaking, and we'll have a house with heat and water and power and all of that good stuff. So we are praising the Lord for that and excited about that. All right, 1 Samuel chapter 27. We will read the entire chapter and actually go into the first two verses of the next chapter. They just seem to me to fit more with this chapter and give us somewhat, not really a conclusion. I think intentionally we're left with a cliffhanger, if you will, in the life of David at the end of verse 2 of chapter 28. But to put you in mind, put you in context, just in the last chapter, just last week, for the second time, God delivered Saul into David's hand to do with him what he pleases. And Saul honored the Lord by not David honored the Lord by not killing Saul and saving Saul's life. And if you remember, David goes and stands on the hill and shouts out to Abner and Saul, and they finally wake up. God had kept them asleep through all of this. They wake up, and David confronts Saul, and Saul, just like the first time, he says, "Oh, I'm a sinful man, and you've done nothing wrong." And he says, "Come back with me." But David refuses to go back with him, and that's how chapter 28 ends. Chapter 26, how chapter 26 ends, and that brings us here to chapter 27. And we find David in a much different place in chapter 27 than in chapter 26, right? In chapter 26, he has trusted God. He has refused to take the life of Saul. He has confronted Abner. He has spoke with Saul. He's literally been standing on the hilltop. But it would seem that he finds himself in a much different place mentally and spiritually here in this chapter. David says in verse 1 of chapter 27, he says in his heart, "Now I shall perish someday by the hand of Saul. There is nothing better for me than that I should speedily escape to the land of the Philistines. And Saul will despair of me to seek me any more in any part of Israel, so I shall escape out of his hand." Then David arose and went over with the 600 men who were with him to Achish, the son of Maok, king of Gath. So David dwelt with Achish at Gath, he and his men, each man with his household, and David with his two wives, Ahinoam the Jezreelitess, and Abigail the Carmelitess, Nabal's widow. And it was told Saul that David had fled to Gath, so he sought him no more. Then David said to Achish, "If I have found favor in your eyes, let them give me a place in some town in the country that I may dwell there. For why should your servant dwell in the royal city with you?" So Achish gave him Ziklag that day. Therefore Ziklag has belonged to the kings of Judah to this day. Now the time that David dwelled in the country of the Philistines was 1 full year and 4 months. And David and his men went up and raided the Geshurites, and the Girzites, and the Amalekites. For those nations were the inhabitants of the land from old, as you go to Shur, even as far as the land of Egypt. And whenever David attacked the land, he left neither man nor woman alive, but took away the sheep, the oxen, the donkeys, the camels, and the apparel, and returned and came to Achish. And Achish would say, "Where have you made a raid today?" And David would say, "Against the southern area of Judah, or against the southern area of the Jerahmeelites, and against the southern area of the Kenites." And David would save neither man nor woman alive to bring news to Gath, saying, lest they should inform on us, saying, "Thus David did." And thus was his behavior all the time he dwelt in the country of the Philistines. So Achish believed David, saying, "He has made his people Israel utterly abhor him. Therefore he will be my servant forever." Verse 1 of chapter 28, it says, "Now it happened in those days that the Philistines gathered their armies together for war to fight with Israel. And Achish said to David, 'You assuredly know that you will go out with me to battle, you and your men.' So David said to Achish, 'Surely you know what your servant can do.' And Achish said to David, 'Therefore I will make you one of my chief guardians forever.'" So here, David, what is happening here in these verses? David decides that it is time to flee Israel, to flee Saul, and he goes into the land of the Philistines and meets with Achish, the king of the Philistines, and somehow finds favor with the king of the Philistines, and asks for a place in a city. He gives him Ziklag. And what David is doing for this year and 4 months, he is attacking the neighbors of Israel, those that they should have put out of Canaan a long time ago when they came in with Joshua. He's putting them out, but he is telling Achish that he is attacking the southern parts of Judah, such that Achish begins to think that, wow, David is really turned on Israel. He has become a stench in the nose of Israel. And so in verse 1 and 2 of chapter 28, King Achish says, "Hey, we're going to fight against Israel, and I want you to be my right-hand man." And David agrees to it. And so this is kind of the lay of things here in this chapter. But it starts with a turn in verse 1. It says, "David said in his heart, 'Now I shall perish someday by the hand of Saul. There is nothing better for me than that I should speedily escape to the land of the Philistines.'" So David has come to a conclusion that it's time for him to flee. And we have to ask ourselves the question, is it right that David would flee Israel? Is it right that he would run to the Philistines to look for harbor there amongst God's enemies? It's not a very easy question to answer, in my opinion. Just to answer that question in and of itself, I don't know that we have necessarily a great answer for it. There are times to flee, right? We understand that there are times to flee persecution. Jesus himself, his parents were warned to go to Egypt because Jesus' life was being sought. Jesus himself, there was a time where he spoke and they wanted to throw him off the cliff, and so God allowed him to pass through and to leave behind those folks that wanted to kill him. Paul, we see Paul taking beatings and suffering persecutions, but then we also see him being let down over the wall so that he can sneak away and keep his life. There are times to flee and there are times to stay. That's a very difficult decision. I don't believe that we have a command that we must always stay. I don't believe that we have the permission to always flee. But when it comes to David, we have more insight than just the question of should he flee or should he not flee. Psalm chapter 11, if you want to turn there, I think gives us some insight. Obviously, David has been on the run from Saul for quite some time. Every time it seems like somebody popped up on Saul and said, "Hey, this is where David is," whether that be David exposing himself by going and protecting the Israelite city that I forget the name of right now, or simply the Ziphites going and telling on David, Saul pops up to try to chase him down. But David says in verse 1 of Psalm 11, "In the Lord I put my trust. How can you say to my soul, flee as a bird to your mountain?" Now at the end of chapter 26, David has called himself before Saul a flea and says, "Why does the king of Israel search for a partridge in the wilderness?" Right? I just can't help but know that it ties in with Psalm 11. Flee as a bird to your mountain. How can you say to my soul, flee as a bird to your mountain? He says, "The wicked bend their bow, they make ready their arrow in the string, that they may shoot secretly at the upright in heart. If the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do?" But look what verse 4 says. The Lord is in his holy temple. The Lord's throne is in heaven. His eyes behold, his eyelids test the sons of men. The Lord tests the righteous, but the wicked and the one who loves violence his soul hates. Upon the wicked he will rain coals, fire and brimstone, and burning wind shall be the portion of their cup. For the Lord is righteous. He loves righteousness. His countenance beholds uprightness. David says, how can I flee away knowing that I am on the Lord's side? How can I fear the wicked knowing that I'm on the Lord's side? But then we come to 1 Samuel chapter 27, and David says in his heart, I must flee. There's two things, and this may, if it helps you, it might not help you, maybe it helps you. You know, as I'm thinking on this very first question and kind of wrestling with this very first question coming into the chapter, we can either look at the consequences of what happens to David, or we can look at David's reasons for fleeing. And I think if you look at the consequences of David's fleeing, that can be very difficult to determine. That can lead us astray. There's a lot of individuals that I hear talk and discuss things and try to prove what is right and what is wrong and what ought to have been or what should have been or what might have been based on outcomes from a situation. If you look at David's life, he flees here. He runs away. What are the consequences? Well, as he runs away, he goes to the Philistines and he finds Achish at Gath and he gains his favor. Well, that worked out well, didn't it? It also says in verse 4 that Saul sought him no more. Well, that worked out well, didn't it? And then when he talks to Achish, Achish gives him Ziklag. Well, now he's got a home. He's got a place. Well, that worked out well, didn't it? Then he begins to attack the enemies of God, and he's gaining victory and gaining spoil. Well, that worked out well, didn't it? Do you see where I'm going? Some of you are smiling and grinning because you know where I'm going with this. If we base right or wrong on the outcomes and consequences, we can very easily be deceived by that, can't we? It's a year and 4 months into David's story where David could argue with himself, see, this worked. See, this is right. Saul hasn't sought me. I have a place for my men. I'm being victorious in battle. And then you come into chapter 8, and now he has made a bed where he's gained trust with the king of the Philistines, and he has lied to the king of the Philistines such that he trusts him to go into battle with him against Israel themselves. And David does not rear up and say, oh, I could never go to fight against Israel. Now, some of you know the rest of the story. We'll leave that for later. God thankfully saves David from himself, from going in against Israel. But I think if you're seeing what I'm seeing, and I'm trying to kind of help you get an image and a picture and an understanding that so many individuals, I think, not only do they miss the reality of doing what God has commanded to do or trying to follow after God, but they make excuses for themselves, or even in doing right, they think, oh, I should have never done that because now I have negative consequences. A lot of times doing something wrong brings short-term good consequences. Am I right? And oftentimes doing the right thing brings some short-term difficult consequences. But we can't say that it's always wrong to flee. We can't say necessarily that it was wrong. The action of him fleeing is always wrong. So what should we look at? And we can see the beginning to the end. We can look a year and 4 months down the road and see where David ends up. But I think that if we would just look in verse 1 and look at David's motivations, look at David's reasoning. What is David saying to himself? It is interesting. Verse 1 starts out with, David said in his heart. David said to himself. We've made this point. There are times that God's word points out specifically, David went and sought the Lord. David went and spoke to the prophet, or David said, bring me the ephod. But then there are times where he doesn't do that. But here he simply says in his heart. But what are his motivations? What are his reasons? The first reason I see in verse 1 is for fear of Saul. He's not motivated by fear of the Lord. He's motivated by fear of Saul. The first thing he says is, now I shall perish someday by the hand of Saul. Is that the promise that God had given him? No, that was not the promise God had given him. By all accounts, if we look at what Saul has at his disposal, if we look at the number of men that Saul comes with versus the number of men that David has, is it reasonable to think that Saul could take David's life? Sure. But if in reality we look back on the details of these stories and look back at how God had protected David over and over again, even just the chapter before, it's unreasonable really to think that God had brought David through these things, that God had raised David up, from a young boy against Goliath into Saul's house and now on the run from Saul, and brought him through these attacks from Saul only for him to eventually and finally perish at the hand of Saul. But David, for some reason, has lost his trust in God. He's lost his perspective. And so his reason, number one, is fear of Saul. We need to be careful that when we are making decisions, because listen, not everything, there are certain things that it's like, yeah, that's sin. That is listed in the Word of God, right? We understand that. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm looking at mature spiritual individuals who make decisions about, should I do this or should I do that? Should I go here or should I go there? Should I stay this? Should I make this change? What am I to do? And number one, never be moved by fear of men. Never be moved by the fear of men. As long as David was moving with fear or awe or concern towards God, he was moving correctly. But as soon as he moved out of fear of Saul, he stepped out of what God would have him to do. So he said, now I shall perish someday by the hand of Saul. So number one, fear of Saul. Number two, he says, there is nothing better for me than that I should speedily escape to the land of the Philistines. So David moved out of fear of Saul, not fear of God. Number two, David believed he had no other options. He believed, I have no other options. What can I do other than get out of here fast? I know I've been here. I can't, for some reason I'm struggling to see if you guys are making any kind of correlation yourselves. I've been there where I'm like, I have no other option but to do this thing. And excuse myself to do something because I don't want to believe in another option, or I see this only option. I'm not willing to seek godly counsel about other options. I'm not willing to trust the Lord to go into the option that He would call me to. And David has narrowed himself mentally and spiritually to the place where he is fearful of men over God, and he sees no other option than to take a humanistic idea or approach to his current set of circumstances. So he sees no other option, and he says to himself, Saul will despair of me and will not seek me anymore in any part of Israel. So number one, he's afraid of men more than fearing God. Number two, he's come to believe that he has no option, he has no choice, even though we know that no temptation is taken but such as is common to man, that God will provide a way of escape. But number three, he is most intently looking for relief from his persecution. That's his biggest concern in this. He said, I'm afraid Saul will take my life. I have no other choice. And if I do this, then it will relieve me of this wilderness difficulty that I'm in. You know, one of the temptations when God allows us into wildernesses, when God brings us intentionally into difficulties, one of the biggest temptations for us to circumnavigate God's will is to find ourselves relief from the tests that God has brought on us. I don't know if you caught that in Psalm chapter 11 where David says, it's almost as if somebody says, David, you need to get out of the country. And he says, how can you say to me, flee the country? I cannot do that. I cannot lose faith in God who has chosen to protect me. The wicked may do this and may do that, but if God chooses to test me, then I'll remain and I'll be tested and I'll trust the Lord. The third thing that I see from David is he wants to be removed from testing. And then lastly, number 4, and so I shall escape out of his hand. We've talked about this. If you've been with us through several weeks, this keeps coming up. Samuel, and now the writer of Samuel keeps bringing this up about being delivered into the hand. What will God of heaven, who is sovereign, allow a man to do? What will be delivered into his hand and what will not be delivered in his hand? And David has come to the place where he has believed, for whatever reason, he has moved to a space where he now believes that God would allow him to be delivered into Saul's hand. And so he's lost faith in God. He has arrived finally at the end of verse 1 at the belief that the only option he has is to flee from Saul, or else God will deliver him into Saul's hand. To me, if you look at David's reasoning, and again, the consequences can be deceitful, but if you look at David's reasoning, to me it's always more important that we recognize so often, especially when we're, hey, should I do this or should I do that? What does God want me to do? I think we torture our teenagers sometimes with finding the will of God, you know? And I try to, in counseling with them and in counseling with adults, and I try to constantly remind myself of this same thing. Listen, God is not looking down with this great puzzle to see if we can figure it out. It's not the God that we serve. He's not looking over us to see if we can somehow figure and get to the end of all things, discern the consequences. What He is looking at is He's looking at our hearts. And what are our reasons? What is our motivation? Based on what do we move? Is it fear of men or fear of God? Is it to relieve ourselves from persecution, or is it to move through the test that He brings upon us well? Is it because we have brought ourselves to a place where we think we have no other choice? Have we lost our faith in God? He says, hey, I don't want to be delivered into Saul's hand. Who does the delivering? It's God. All right? If David's to be delivered into Saul's hand, that's of the Lord, and God has shown that to him over and over and over again. I couldn't help but ask, where is the faith of the one who didn't kill Saul, the one who stood before him? Where is the faith of the one who wrote Psalm 11? Number one, our victory in one place in life does not guarantee our victory in another. Victory in one place does not guarantee victory in another. It was just a couple of weeks ago, or no, it was last week that we said victory in one place does not excuse failure in another. Right? But here, victory in one place or victory in one time in life does not guarantee victory later in life. Just because David has stood strong doesn't mean that he'll always stand strong. David has been a good example in many chapters, but this chapter is a reminder that David is not the hero of the story. God is the hero of David's story. Me and Jasper have been watching those missionary stories. If I can recommend you spend $5 a month on anything, Answers in Genesis has an app with TV shows on it. Me and Jasper have been watching The Torchlighters, which is all these missionary stories. They're great. And something that one of the pastors said in the little cartoon, I paused it and I started quizzing Jasper, and he was absolutely right. He didn't miss a beat on it. I said, who has been the hero in all these missionary stories? And he said, God. It's not the missionaries that are the heroes. It's God who keeps coming in and saving these missionaries who are doing foolish things by man's thought processes, but wonderful and faithful things by God's calling. And God comes in and rescues them. And so for David, just because he has been a great example, we see him fall, and he's not the hero of the story. Number two, how can the one who wrote Psalm 11 and say, how can I flee, then turn around and flee? If you've ever been a preacher or a teacher or a parent or an advisor or a counselor, you know how. Right? Because so often it's so easy to say the right things, but then in the moment of personal difficulty, to go down the wrong path yourself. And I believe that's where we find David. And then thirdly, because we are human, because we are frail, physically we have weak days. Physically we have weak days. David finds himself in verse 1, I believe, in a place of physical weakness. He's tired. He's tired of running. I saw it. It used to be on the table out there because of the Rule 62 guys that are out there with the alcoholics group. But it's halt, stop. Are you hungry, angry, lonely, or tired? Oh man, that's practical. That's helpful. Now, is David probably hungry? Maybe. Is he angry? Possibly. Is he lonely? Possibly. Is he tired? Possibly. Are any of those excuses to go and sin? No. None of those are excuses to go and sin. But do they impact and increase temptation? Yes, absolutely, I believe that they do. Because we are physical beings. We are somewhat tied mentally, physically, and of course spiritually. These are the questions that I had in regards to these things. I think it's beneficial that we would also always look at the reasons. Always search your own heart. Ask God in prayer to search your heart. What are my motivations for going this way or for going that? And ask Him to search your heart. Ask Him to enlighten your mind. Because our heart, I don't know if you've heard or not, but our heart is desperately wicked. We can't even know our own hearts at times. We can excuse our own motivations. We can excuse our own reasonings. And then beware. Beware that it's often easier to say than it is to do. Beware that one victory does not guarantee another. Beware that some days you'll be more prone to temptation, and those days are a reminder that I need Thee every hour. And pray that God would keep us from temptation and deliver us from evil. Let's pray. God, we thank You for Your word that shows Your people, God, in the true light. It doesn't airbrush individuals to make them out to be something greater than they are. God, because we're all human. God, we all struggle with decisions. We all struggle with temptations.